I never expected that coming home from a 15-month deployment in Afghanistan would lead to war with my neighborhood HOA and their power-hungry president. How was I supposed to know that standing up for my property rights would expose years of corrupt practices and finally bring accountability to our entire suburban community? I dropped my duffel bag on the driveway and stared in disbelief at the scene before me. After 6 years of military service and a final tour as a transportation logistics officer, I'd been looking forward to the peaceful backyard sanctuary I'd created before deployment. Instead, I found cars, at least 8 of them, parked on what used to be my meticulously maintained lawn. My prized Japanese maple had been removed, the raised garden beds were gone, and someone had laid down gravel over most of the area. "What the hell?" I muttered, pulling out my phone to call my neighbor Jim, who had promised to keep an eye on the place while I was overseas. "Daniel, you're back early," Jim answered, sounding uncomfortable. "Jim, there are cars parked all over my backyard. What happened?" A long pause. "Look, I tried to stop it, but the Lakeside Estates HOA voted to use your property as overflow parking while you were deployed. They said military personnel on active duty couldn't contest HOA emergency measures." My blood pressure soared. "That's absolutely not legal. They can't just convert my private property." I know, Jim sounded apologetic. "But Patricia Winters, she's the new HOA president. She pushed it through. Said it was temporary until you returned. The clubhouse parking lot is being renovated, and they needed the space." I thanked Jim for the information and ended the call, then walked around to inspect the damage. Behind my modest ranch-style home, what had once been a peaceful retreat now resembled a makeshift parking lot. Someone had even installed a small sign, "Lakeside Estates Overflow Parking." The irony wasn't lost on me. For 15 months, I'd coordinated massive transportation operations for the military, managing vehicle logistics across hostile terrain. Now I couldn't even control what happened in my own backyard. I spent my first night back on American soil, drafting emails, instead of enjoying the homecoming I'd dreamed about. First to my lawyer, then to the HOA board, attaching photos of the damage and requesting an immediate meeting. The response came by 7 a.m. the following morning. "Mr. Reeves, welcome home and thank you for your service. The board can meet with you next Tuesday at 7 p.m. In the meantime, please understand that the temporary parking arrangement was approved unanimously as an emergency measure and has been greatly appreciated by the community. Patricia Winters, President, Lakeside Estates HOA. I showed up at the HOA office the next morning anyway. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, looked startled when I walked in. "I need to speak with Patricia Winters," I said firmly. "Ms. Winters only takes appointments," she replied, clearly uncomfortable, "and she's in meetings all day." "I understand, but this is urgent. The HOA has converted my private property into a parking lot without permission while I was deployed. Overseas." Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, you must be the military homeowner from the Aberdeen Street property." "Daniel Reeves," I confirmed. "And yes, I'd like an explanation." "Let me see what I can do," she offered, picking up her phone. 10 minutes later, I was ushered into a conference room where Patricia Winters sat at the head of a large table. She was exactly as I'd pictured from Jim's description. Mid-50s, immaculately dressed, with a practiced smile that never reached her eyes. "Mr. Reeves," she stood, extending her hand. "While we appreciate your eagerness, we do have procedures. The board meeting on Tuesday would have been the appropriate venue for this discussion." I didn't take her hand. "Ms. Winters, you've converted my private property into a parking lot without permission. That requires immediate attention, not a scheduled meeting 5 days from now." She gestured to a chair. "Please sit. I understand you're upset, but there's been a misunderstanding. The HOA has emergency provisions that allow for temporary use of properties when owners are absent for extended periods. No such provision would apply to my private backyard," I countered, remaining standing. And removing landscaping I invested thousands in goes well beyond temporary use. Patricia's smile tightened. The community has been very grateful for the additional parking during the clubhouse renovation. Surely, as someone who serves the greater good, you can appreciate community needs. Don't use my military service to justify trespassing, I said, coolly. I want all vehicles removed from my property by tomorrow morning, and I expect compensation for the damage. Patricia's demeanor shifted slightly. That's simply not possible. The clubhouse parking won't be completed for another 3 weeks. We can discuss compensation at that time. 3 weeks? Absolutely not. This ends now. Mr. Reeves, her voice took on a condescending tone, you need to understand that we vote on these matters as a community. One person's inconvenience doesn't outweigh the needs of 97 families. I leaned forward. And you need to understand that what you've done is illegal. There was no vote that could make this legitimate. I left Patricia's office seething with anger, but determined to get to the bottom of this situation. Despite spending years coordinating complex military operations, I couldn't get a straight answer about who authorized turning my backyard into a parking lot. When I arrived home, I found 3 more cars parked on my property. A woman was just getting out of a blue sedan, gathering shopping bags from her trunk. "Excuse me," I said, approaching her. "You're parked on private property." She looked confused. "This is the HOA overflow parking. Patricia said we could use it while the clubhouse lot is being renovated." "This is my backyard," I explained. "I just returned from military deployment, and I never authorized anyone to park here." The woman's expression changed to embarrassment. "I had no idea. Patricia told everyone that the homeowner had agreed to help the community during the renovation. I'm so sorry." This conversation repeated itself 3 more times that afternoon as residents came to retrieve their vehicles. All had been told by Patricia that I had enthusiastically offered my yard to help the community. None knew I'd been deployed overseas. That evening, I called a meeting with a few trusted neighbors. Jim arrived first, followed by the Parkers from across the street and Elaine Rodriguez, who'd lived in Lakeside Estates for 20 years. "This isn't the first time Patricia has overstepped," Elaine explained, sipping her coffee. 3 years ago, she had the Johnsons' oak tree removed while they were on vacation, claiming it violated height restrictions. That tree was planted when they built the house, before the HOA even existed. She also hired her nephew's landscaping company for all HOA contracts without any bidding process, added Mike Parker. The fees doubled that year. I took notes as they shared their stories. Why hasn't anyone challenged her? The group exchanged glances. Jim finally spoke. "Patricia's husband is a city council member. She's got connections with the local zoning board, building inspectors, you name it. People who've opposed her have suddenly found themselves dealing with code violations or permit problems." That night I couldn't sleep. I thought about my career in transportation logistics and the leadership principles I'd learned in the military. Sometimes you need to understand the entire battlefield before planning your strategy. The next morning I visited the county recorder's office. The clerk helped me search property records related to my home and the HOA's jurisdiction. After 2 hours, I found something interesting. The original HOA agreement established in 1995 clearly defined common areas versus private property, and backyards were explicitly protected from HOA jurisdiction except for specific safety concerns. Next, I met with my attorney, Sofia Menendez. She reviewed the documents and shook her head. "This is clear trespassing and property damage," she confirmed. "The HOA had no authority to convert your backyard to parking. The fact that you were on active military duty makes it worse. There are federal protections for deployed service members. What about this emergency provision Patricia mentioned?" I asked. "Nothing in these documents supports that claim," Sophia replied, flipping through the pages. I suspect she's relying on most people's unwillingness to read the fine print. We can file an injunction immediately. Later that afternoon, I received a text from Jim with a photo of a new sign being installed at the entrance to my backyard. Authorized vehicles only, HOA approved parking. That was the final straw. I drove to the county transportation department where an old army buddy now worked. Greg had offered to help me navigate my transition to civilian life, suggesting I consider applying my logistics expertise in public service. "Hey, Daniel," Craig greeted me warmly. "Have you thought more about that position we discussed? State Transportation Authority needs good leaders, and your experience coordinating vehicle movements in Afghanistan would be perfect." "Actually, I'm here about something else," I explained the situation with my backyard. Craig whistled. "That's outrageous, but I think I can help. Let me make a call." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Rebecca Torres, the county's code enforcement manager. "Your property was never rezoned for public parking," she confirmed after checking the records. "And even if the HOA wanted to establish a temporary parking area, they'd need permits, proper drainage, safety inspections, none of which were filed." "What can I do?" I asked. "Document everything," Rebecca advised. "Then file a formal complaint. Given your military status, this will get expedited review. I'd also suggest consulting with the Service Members Civil Relief Act representative at the VE." Armed with this knowledge, I returned home to find Patricia herself directing a resident to park in my backyard. I approached calmly, phone recording in my pocket. "Ms. Winters, I've checked with county records. There was never any permit filed to convert my property to parking. You need to remove these vehicles immediately." Patricia's smile was cold. "Mr. Reeves, you're being needlessly difficult. The HOA has broad discretionary powers during renovation projects. I'd hate to see this escalate into something unpleasant." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. She lowered her voice. "My husband sits on the zoning board. People who create problems for the community often find themselves facing unexpected inspections or permit reviews. Your fence appears to be slightly higher than regulation, for instance." "Are you threatening me?" I asked, making sure my phone captured her response. Patricia stepped back. "Of course not. I'm simply suggesting that good neighbors work together. This parking situation will resolve itself in a few weeks. Don't make this into a bigger issue than it needs to be." As she walked away, I noticed a familiar face getting out of a car across the street. It was Craig from the transportation department, watching the exchange with interest. He gave me a subtle nod, and I knew then that my battle plan was taking shape. That evening, I drafted an email to all HOA board members, except Patricia, attaching county records, property documents, and the recorded conversation. This wasn't just about my backyard anymore. It was about accountability and proper governance. The next morning, a fleet of official vehicles from the county transportation department lined the street in front of my house. Workers in bright yellow vests placed traffic cones at the entrance to my backyard, while others posted official notices on each car parked on my property. I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the operation unfold with a sense of calm determination. My phone buzzed. It was Craig. "How's it going? I see the team arrived on schedule." "Perfect timing," I replied. "Should I expect Patricia soon?" "Based on the 3 calls she's already made to the department, I'd say she's on her way now." Sure enough, Patricia's luxury SUV came screeching around the corner 5 minutes later. She parked haphazardly at the curb and stormed toward the workers, designer handbags swinging wildly from her arm. When she spotted me, she changed direction. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, face flushed with anger. "Enforcing county regulations," I replied calmly. "These vehicles are illegally parked on private property without proper permits or safety measures." "I've already called the transportation department," she said, voice rising. "This will be resolved immediately." I nodded. "I know. They transferred you to Craig Thompson, who explained that the department is responding to a formal complaint about unpermitted use of residential property for public parking. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Who, exactly, do you think you are? Someone who understands regulations, I said simply. The county requires permits for any temporary parking facility, even on private property. There are drainage requirements, safety inspections, handicap accessibility standards, none of which were met here. This is HOA business, she insisted. Your military background doesn't give you special privileges to disrupt community solutions. I smiled slightly. Actually, my background in transportation logistics makes me particularly qualified to spot improper vehicle management. And my rights under the Service Members Civil Relief Act protected my property while I was deployed. The first tow truck arrived as we were speaking. A young driver jumped out and approached us with a clipboard. Mr. Reeves, we're ready to begin. Removing the unauthorized vehicles. Patricia stepped between us. You can't do this. These people need somewhere to park. I gave notice yesterday, I explained to the driver, ignoring Patricia. All vehicle owners were informed that towing would begin at 9 a.m. Patricia pulled out her phone. I'm calling my husband right now. He's on the city council, and he'll put a stop to this immediately. That won't be necessary, came a voice from behind us. A tall woman in a professional suit approached, hand extended. Rebecca Torres, County Code Enforcement. Mr. Reeves filed the proper paperwork for this action yesterday afternoon. Patricia's confidence wavered visibly. There must be some misunderstanding. The HOA has authority. The HOA has no authority to convert private residential property into a parking lot, Rebecca interrupted, opening a folder. That requires proper permits, which were never filed. Additionally, we have concerns about the removal of established vegetation and improper surface materials used. As they spoke, residents began arriving, alerted by a text chain about the towing operation. A crowd gathered at the edge of my property, watching nervously as the first car was hooked up to the tow truck. A middle-aged man in a business suit pushed through the crowd. "Patricia, what's happening? My wife says they're towing our cars." Before Patricia could answer, I stepped forward. I'm Daniel Reeves, the homeowner. While I was deployed in Afghanistan, the HOA converted my backyard into parking without permission. I've given everyone notice that the vehicles need to be removed. Murmurs spread through the crowd. The man looked shocked. Patricia told us you had agreed to this arrangement. I was never consulted, I said firmly. In fact, I returned from deployment to find my landscaping destroyed and gravel laid over my property. More residents joined the group, many quickly moving to retrieve their vehicles before they could be towed. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to anger, not at me, but at Patricia. An elderly woman approached me. "Young man, we had no idea." Patricia announced at the board meeting that you had volunteered your yard as a patriotic contribution to the community while the clubhouse was being renovated. I turned to Patricia, whose composure was crumbling. "Is that true? You told them I volunteered my property." She straightened her jacket. "It was a simple misunderstanding. You assumed I wouldn't return from deployment to contest." I suggested. The crowd's mood darkened further. A board member I recognized from the HOA website stepped forward. "Patricia, you told us explicitly that you had written permission." Patricia's phone rang, saving her from responding. "Yes, dear," she answered, then paused, her expression changing. "What do you mean you can't help? Call someone else then." She ended the call abruptly, looking flustered. "Problem with your connections at the city?" I asked quietly. She glared. "And me? This isn't over. The HOA has resources you can't imagine." Rebecca from Code Enforcement, who had been listening nearby, stepped closer. Ms. Winters, I should inform you that threatening a resident based on your husband's position could constitute an ethics violation. Patricia paled slightly. I wasn't threatening anyone. I pulled out my phone and played the recording from yesterday. Her voice came through clearly. My husband sits on the zoning board. People who create problems for the community often find themselves facing unexpected inspections or permit reviews. The crowd fell silent. The board member who had spoken earlier looked appalled. Patricia, we need to discuss this immediately. This is completely inappropriate. As the confrontation unfolded, Craig approached and handed me a business card. Daniel, can we talk privately for a moment? We stepped away from the crowd. The State Transportation Director reviewed your service record and the situation here, Craig said quietly. He's impressed with how you've handled this and wants to meet with you next week. The deputy position we discussed is opening sooner than expected. I glanced back at the scene in my yard. Residents retrieving vehicles, Patricia arguing with board members, and Rebecca writing citations for the HOA violations. Tell him I'd be honored, I replied. By noon, my backyard was empty of vehicles. Though the damage remained, gravel spread where my garden had been, tire marks cutting through what remained of the lawn. But as I surveyed the scene, I felt a sense of victory that went beyond reclaiming my property. Sometimes, standing up for what's right requires strategic planning and the courage to confront power directly. The following weeks transformed both my property and our community in ways I never anticipated. 3 days after the towing incident, a landscaping crew arrived at my home unannounced. I watched cautiously from my window as trucks pulled up, until I recognized Jim among the workers. "What's all this?" I asked, stepping onto my porch. Jim grinned, handing me a clipboard with a detailed restoration plan. "The HOA's paying to restore your backyard. Complete replacement of your Japanese. Maple, new raised beds, sod installation, everything exactly as you had it before deployment." The paperwork included a formal apology from the Lakeside Estates Board of Directors, acknowledging the unauthorized use of my property and accepting full financial responsibility for restoration. Patricia's signature was noticeably absent. "The board voted unanimously," Jim explained, now speaking as the newly appointed interim HOA president. "Patricia resigned yesterday. The ethics investigation into her husband's potential conflicts of interest is ongoing." Over the next few days, I learned the full story from various neighbors who stopped by to welcome me home properly. Patricia had apparently been running the HOA like her personal fiefdom for years, making unilateral decisions while threatening anyone who opposed her with her husband's municipal connections. My backyard wasn't the first property she'd commandeered, just the first time someone had successfully fought back. "You've done what many of us wanted to do for years," Elaine Rodriguez told me, bringing over a homemade lasagna. "It wasn't just about the parking, it was about standing up to intimidation." By the following week, my backyard restoration was well underway, and I had accepted the deputy director position at the State Transportation Authority. During my first staff meeting, the director introduced me with unexpected praise. "Daniel comes to us with exceptional experience coordinating complex transportation operations in challenging environments," he announced. He also recently demonstrated remarkable poise, handling a local issue that revealed serious regulatory oversights in how some HOAs operate without proper permits or authority. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. "That HOA situation has sparked some interesting conversations at the state level. We've had multiple reports of similar abuses where associations exceed their authority, particularly regarding veterans' properties during deployment. I was just protecting my own backyard," I admitted. "Sometimes that's how important policy changes begin," he replied. "Would you be interested in helping develop new guidelines for temporary use permits? Your perspective would be valuable." 1 month after returning home, I hosted a neighborhood barbecue in my fully restored backyard. The Japanese maple was smaller than my original tree, but the landscapers had found a mature replacement that would grow beautifully. My raised garden beds were rebuilt, filled with fresh soil and already sprouting vegetable seedlings. The gathering wasn't just a celebration of my homecoming, but had evolved into something more meaningful, a community recommitment to transparency and proper governance. The new HOA board members all attended, as did Rebecca from Code Enforcement and Craig from the Transportation Department. Jim raised his glass for a toast. To Daniel, who reminded us that sometimes you need to fight for your own piece of ground. As conversations flowed around me, Rebecca joined me by the grill. "Your case inspired something important," she said. "The county is implementing new requirements for HOA governance and training. Patricia's actions violated multiple regulations, but the system allowed it to happen." "Any news about her?" I asked, flipping burgers. Her husband stepped down from the zoning board after investigators found evidence he'd expedited permits for friends and delayed them for people who opposed. "Patricia, they've put their house on the market." Later that evening, as neighbors helped clean up, Elaine handed me a gift, a framed copy of the original neighborhood plat map from when Lakeside Estates was first developed. "I thought you might appreciate this," she smiled. "It clearly shows the property lines and original intent for each homeowner's space. The new board is giving a copy to every resident so everyone understands their rights." The map was beautiful, but the inscription Elaine had added at the bottom meant even more. Sometimes one person standing firm can strengthen an entire community. The following week, I received an unexpected call from a state senator's office. The senator had heard about my situation through the transportation director and wanted to discuss potential legislation to protect deployed military personnel's property rights. That conversation led to my testimony before a state legislative committee, sharing my experience and advocating for clearer regulations regarding HOA powers. 6 months after my return from Afghanistan, Governor Mills signed the Service Members' Property Protection Act, with me standing among the honored guests. The law established clear limitations on what actions could be taken regarding a deployed service member's property and created an expedited complaint process if violations occurred. This legislation ensures that those serving our country don't have to worry about fighting battles on the home front when they return, the governor said during the signing ceremony. "No one should come home from defending our freedoms to find their own property rights violated." As I returned to my now peaceful backyard that evening, I reflected on the unexpected journey. What began as a personal fight for my property had cascaded into meaningful change for veterans across the state. The Japanese maple was thriving, its delicate leaves rustling in the evening breeze. My garden beds overflowed with summer vegetables. My phone chimed with a message from Craig. "Transportation Committee meeting tomorrow. The Senator wants to discuss extending the parking permit reform statewide. Your input requested." I smiled, remembering how differently things might have gone if I hadn't stood my ground. Sometimes the most important battles aren't the ones we're deployed for, but the ones we find waiting for us when we return home. My military logistics experience had taught me to approach problems systematically, gathering intelligence before acting. But it was the courage to confront injustice directly that had made the real difference. The following weekend, a young couple who had just moved into the neighborhood stopped by to introduce themselves. The husband was active duty Navy, about to leave for a 6-month deployment. "We heard what you did," his wife said. "It makes us feel safer knowing people look out for each other here." I handed them my card with both my personal number and my office contact at the Transportation Authority. "If you need anything while he's away, don't hesitate to call." That's what community should be about. As they walked away, I noticed the New sign the HOA had installed at the entrance to our neighborhood, Lakeside Estates, where every property is respected and every voice matters. Sometimes reclaiming your own small piece of earth can change the landscape for everyone. The story of my backyard battle faded from neighborhood gossip as months passed, replaced by seasonal celebrations and the rhythm of suburban life. But its impact continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. One crisp autumn evening, as I worked late at the Transportation Authority, my assistant transferred a call from a military officer stationed in Germany. "Sir, I've never met you," the voice began, "but your case is being used in our pre-deployment briefings now. They're calling it the Reeves Protocol, documenting your property condition before deployment and understanding your legal protections." Similar calls came from veterans advocacy groups, legal aid organizations, and even other state agencies studying our new legislation as a model. What had begun as a personal stand against an overreaching HOA had evolved into a template for protecting service members' rights nationwide. A year after the incident, I received an invitation to speak at a national conference on property rights and municipal governance. There, in the hotel lobby, I encountered a familiar face, Patricia Winters, now working for a property management firm in another state. Our eyes met briefly. She hesitated, then approached with a strained smile. "Mr. Reeves," she nodded, "I heard you were speaking about HOA reforms." "I am," I replied, unsure what else to say. She glanced around before speaking quietly. "What happened in Lakeside Estates?" She paused. It was wrong. I let power become more important than people. Before I could respond, she handed me a business and card. "My new company specializes in HOA compliance training. We use your case as our primary example of what not to do." I accepted the card, recognizing that accountability comes in many forms. "That's good to hear." Back home, the most meaningful change was visible in our transformed community. The new HOA operated with unprecedented transparency. Meetings were recorded and shared online, financial decisions required multiple approvals, and a special committee ensured military families received additional support during deployments. My backyard became a gathering place for neighborhood events. The Japanese maple grew stronger each season, its roots spreading deeper into the soil that had once been covered in unauthorized gravel. Sometimes during community gatherings, newer residents would ask about the tree's story, and the tale would be retold, often growing more dramatic with each telling. On the second anniversary of my return from deployment, I received a package from a soldier currently stationed in the Middle East. Inside was a handmade plaque featuring a small piece of metal shaped like a parking sign, bent and twisted into the form of a tree. The note read, "Sir, your fight made it possible for me to know my home will still be mine when I return. Some battles matter most after we come home." I mounted the plaque beside my front door, a reminder that standing firm against injustice often protects more than just yourself. Last month, I testified before Congress about expanding the Service Members Property Protection Act nationally. As I described finding strange cars in my backyard that first day home, I noticed several representatives nodding in recognition. The story had spread far beyond our community. The HOA president who replaced Jim recently asked if I would consider serving on the board. I declined politely, preferring my role as an informal advisor. Some battles are worth fighting, but not all leadership positions need to be filled. What began with tow trucks and property disputes had transformed into something far more meaningful, a community that understood the true value of protection, respect, and accountability. And if you visit Lakeside Estates today, you'll notice something special. Next to every deployed service member's home stands a small Japanese maple sapling, a living symbol of what we protect when we protect each Others' rights